A warm welcome to you all. Jake Crulee podcast. Thank you so much for tuning into this transmission. And also to you, Patrick. Thank you so much for coming on the show and to be willing to share your life journey and your wisdom and your teachings with us also. I appreciate your time and I appreciate you doing this. And just for anyone who is listening to this audio or watching the video, can you please introduce yourself for them?
Sure, Jake, and thanks for having me on. Looking forward to it. My name is Patrick, excuse me, Patrick Chester, and I live in Seattle, Washington. So I'm, a few miles away from where you are currently, but
Yeah.
that's who I am, and that's where I'm at.
Awesome. Did you grow up in Seattle? And how would you, like, for me, I like to really engage in the life journey aspect from childhood to where or like where you are now. So like, where did you grow up and how would you describe your childhood and your adolescent years?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm born and raised in this area, up in the northwest corner of the U.S. And I grew up in a pretty typical. I had a pretty typical upbringing. It was pretty standard. Except for the fact that my parents divorced when I was 9. I had a sister, and my parents divorced when I was 9, and from that point forward, it was pretty much my mom raising the two of us. But we went through school, and went to high school and college and did all of that, and like I say, pretty much spent my whole life here, other than aside from a few different spells. I worked in Alaska for a couple of years and that sort of thing, and things like that. But my childhood was, it was pretty normal. My dad was my dad was an alcoholic and a fairly, he was verbally abusive as well. And so as we kind of get into some of my struggles and my journey, that kind of comes to the surface a little bit here and there. But other than that, it was pretty standard as far as my childhood and that sort of thing.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And just briefly, you were speaking about your father and some of the ways that he expressed himself. How do you think that impacted on your life, like growing up?
It's hard to say growing up. When I was young, it's hard to say how that impacted me, because I just didn't. As we get older, we start to process what we see and hear as we're kids, right? You don't process it at that age, but looking back now, I didn't get the same things from my father that many of my friends got. You look to your father or your parents for guidance. You look to them for lessons, right? I didn't get any of that, and so as I kind of got into my high school and college years and early 20s, is really when some things started to bubble up to the surface. Whereas my friends weren't having some of the same problems I was having, or didn't make some of the same choices I was making. I think because they had more of a role model and a better system in place as they were growing up, and I just didn't have that, And so again, as we can get into some of my struggles, I think a lot of it goes back to my childhood, when my dad was coming home drunk, when he was coming home, and yelling and screaming and doing the things he was doing, and going out with his friends and gambling and doing all these things that you see your dad do, that as a child you don't really process, and so they seem like harmless activities, and until you get older and you realize, wow, it does have an effect, and it did have an effect on me as I got older.
Yeah, no, I can totally understand that. And is your father still around? And how was it? Like, I'm kind of jumping to the end story with you and your father, but how was that relationship now with you both? Like, were you able to reconcile with him and have these conversations with him?
A great question. He's not here anymore. He died back in 2000 and he was, he died fairly young. He was, I think, 66 or 67 when he died, and that was a really difficult period of my life because I was really struggling with my own addiction, which we'll get into. And so mentally, I wasn't in a good place. But when he died, I remember I did have a conversation with. He was on hospice, so we kind of knew it was coming. It wasn't a sudden thing. So I do remember having a conversation with him before he died, and really just hoping that he would kind of own um, some of the things he did when we were kids. If he would have just, because he never did, he never took ownership or never came out and said, you know what, I could have been better. I could have been a better father. I'm sorry about that. I was looking for that from him towards the end of his life, and I never got that. And, and that's all I needed, right? I understand maybe he was going through some struggles when I was a kid and he acted a certain way and it affected me. But at the end of the day, all I really cared about was if he would have just said, hey, I'm sorry. I wish I would have been better at this or that. And I never got that. So from here, from that point forward, I still unfortunately have some resentment towards him. And I wish I didn't, but it's just the way it is sometimes.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. Life is it's interesting like that. And did he ever? Did you ever have a conversation with him, or did you ever? Did he ever allow you to understand like why he was doing what he was doing? Like, what was he specifically trying to potentially escape or medicate himself?
No, and he's one of these people that I would describe as somebody that always took the old school approach to everything, right? Meaning mental health, addiction, verbal abuse, all the things that um, I try and talk about with my kids and be open about mental health, especially. He would shy away from all that. He was stubborn. He grew towards the end of his life very bitter, and I think a lot of that bitterness he had with him towards the end was because he knew deep down that he had failed as a father. And again, I always tried to. I did have a couple of conversations with him towards the end, and it was in a way where I was trying to open the door for him to walk through, and so we can have a real father son conversation instead of this superficial. Our relationship was very superficial, right? It was never. We wouldn't go out fishing as a father and son. We wouldn't do father son things, so to speak. It was very superficial. And again, towards the end, I tried to, I told him I loved him, and I said, hey, I'd like to talk to you about um, some things. As now I'm a father of a young kid at the time, I had a young son at the time. I'd like to ask you some questions, and just trying to get him to open up, but he never would. He just never would. And so it's unfortunate, but you know, I did learn a lot. And now that I'm a father of two boys, I've taken a lot from that, and so I can always draw from that and tell myself, whoa, don't do that or don't do this because that's what your father did, and be open with your kids. And so it's, in a way, it's really helped me and helped guide me as a father to my two boys.
When you were growing up, let's say maybe your adolescence, like early 20s, or maybe when you were in your first relationship, did any of these like mental or emotional um, expressions like express themselves through you in relationships? For me personally, like having gone through some difficult times, some trauma, not really having a family and having parents around. I think I wasn't emotionally stable. So when I was in my first relationship towards the end of high school, it really came out, and I didn't know it was there until it was there. So I'm just curious to know, did things come out where you maybe you 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 couldn't communicate and you were like emotionally turbulent And how did you rectify that if you did experience that?
Well, I did, and that's a great question, because I did go through certain things that, say, behaviors that my father exhibited when I was a kid were starting to come out in me. I wouldn't say necessarily in my first relationship, but as I met my what would eventually be my wife, early on in our relationship, and this was tied into my addiction quite a bit too. But my father was very irrational, right? Very unpredictable. He never knew who you were going to get, So, am I going to get the nice dad coming through the door, or am I going to get the raging lunatic who's been out drinking for the last 10 hours? And so, um, the behaviors, and so I would have outbursts. I would overreact to a certain situation and become very defensive, and those sorts of things. And I those are all things that I got from him. I didn't know it at the time, like you mentioned, like with you. You don't necessarily process it or realize what's going on at the time. But looking back now, just the unpredictability of the irrational behaviors, and also too, going back to what I said a little while ago, is he didn't teach me anything. And so as I'm engaged to be married and buying a house and doing all this stuff with my soon to be wife, like, I had no financial guidance as a kid from my father, like no structure. Like, I didn't know how to manage my money at all. And so those are things that all showed up, in my 20s and into my early 30s, that were problematic, to be sure.
And it can be quite anxiety provoking, like not knowing who's coming through the door, whether it's going to be the happy dad or the drunk and angry dad. So I can, yeah, definitely understand what that feels like. And could you take us back, like take me back to like the period in your life when you began gambling? Like, when was it just a hobby?
Yeah, sure. So it began as a hobby right around, I'd say around 2001, is really when I started doing it as what I viewed as a harmless activity, with friends and that sort of thing. And that's about the period of time. And I would have been 20, I don't know, shoot, around 30 years old at the time, I think 28, 29, somewhere in there. But that was about the period when it started. And I would gamble a little bit here, a little bit there. And then as we progressed into, 2, 3, 4 years down the road, is when I started betting more and more and more. And the size of my bets grew. The choices I was making were not good. I would instead of paying rent, for example, I would, for example, I was living with a couple of buddies during that period of time, the early years, and we would split the rent 3 ways, and I just, come rent day, I didn't have it because I had taken that money that should have been allocated for my rent, and I was gambling with it. So then starts the process of um, spending money that you don't really have on what started out as an innocent hobby, right? And so, and going back to my childhood real quick, that's how I viewed it. I saw my dad doing this. He gambled and he drank with his buddies, and I looked at that as like exciting, fun, that, and I didn't see the dangers of it. So, as we progressed kind of through the early 2000s, that's what was starting to happen.
When you weren't paying your rent, like when you would use the money to gamble, how were you rationalizing it in your head? How were you able to convince yourself that it's okay to do that?
That's the interesting part with a gambling addict that a lot of people, it's hard for people to understand. The brain of a gambling addict isn't much different than an alcoholic or a heroin addict, for example. And so my whole thought process was, I'm just going to win more money. Okay. And so I may take $1,500 that I was going to pay for, use for rent, dump it on a football game, because what I'm going to do in my mind is I'm going to win, and then I'm going to double or triple that money, and then I can pay the rent. And I'll just tell my roommates, hey, it's going to be a couple days late. hope that's no problem. Because in my mind, I'm telling myself that I'll win this money and then I'll get that money back in a couple of days, pay them. More often than not, I would lose, right? And so then now we're 3 or 4 days, 5 days later, and I'm coming up with another excuse why I don't have the money to pay the rent, and so you can kind of see the cycle here as it's beginning, and that's what's starting to happen as I'm digging myself a hole. But yeah, in my mind, I could always rationalize it because I was just telling myself, convincing myself that I was just going to double up and win more.
Mm. Yeah, I've come across that mentality before, and actually, like the reason why I wanted to do this is because gambling in my family, like in my town, like in my small town, is really it's a big issue, and it's I think in New Zealand in general, it's a really big issue. So that's why I wanted to talk with you and to try and understand what what my loved ones are going through and experiencing, and I hope they listen to this and they can take something away from it. What were you specifically gambling on when you first started, and did that expand?
Yeah, it did. I grew up a huge football fan, and so over here we have college football and the NFL, which are both really popular. I grew up a huge college football fan, and so I was betting primarily on college football games, and when I started, we didn't have all of the. Now it's legal here to bet in most of the states in the U.S. on sports. It's legal now, whereas before when I started, it was only legal in Las Vegas and New Jersey, I think. And so I was betting offshore. I had money in offshore accounts and doing that sort of thing. But it started with football games, and then as it progressed, as my addiction got worse and worse, it expanded. I started betting on baseball games and rugby games and soccer games and hockey games and all of these different sports all day long. Like I would be betting on all throughout the night and throughout the day, and because it was never enough. It was just never enough. I needed that. My brain needed that constant action. To keep, just to feed my addiction is what was happening. And so, yeah, that's what it was. It was football games primarily to start, but then it grows from there.
Was it always was the purpose and the rationality of it always to win more money? Like when you would win money, would it would you continue doing it just to win more money? Like what do you think allowed you to just continue gambling all those years?
So the money thing is, yeah, that's interesting because it was never enough. I mean, I did have some big wins for sure. I mean, um, towards the as my addiction progressed, I was betting 15, 20, $30,000 on a single game, and whether I won or lost, it was almost irrelevant because the money was never enough. I could win in my mind. I would tell myself, okay, if I win 15 grand or 30 grand on this game, I'm done. I'm going to pay these guys off, and then I'm walking away from this. But that would never happen because it was never ever enough. And I started digging myself such a hole where I was 50 grand in the hole, and then I'm 150 grand in the hole. And before I knew it, I was $500,000 in the hole. And so there was no way it was ever going to be enough. And, you know, even when I won a game or something, or won 10 or 15 grand, I just knew in the back of my mind, I was just going to double it up on something else until I lost. And so it's this constant back and forth inside the brain of a gambling addict where you're getting these hits of dopamine, whether we win or whether we lose. And it's a constant back and forth where at the time, I had no idea why I was doing what I was doing or why I was making the choices I was making to feed my addiction. But now looking back on it, now that I know a little bit more about what gambling addiction is, it's really this process in the brain where there's really no shut off valve, if you know what I mean. There's no, okay, well, I won that, I can just quit now. Because it's very much like heroin addiction or alcoholism in the brain. And so it's just really difficult to shut that down.
Yeah, I've actually been in predicaments where I've like chauffeured people to casinos, and sometimes I would go in with them, and they would say, I'm just here to win a few $1,000s, and I'm going to pull it out, and then we're going to go. and they'll win the thousands of dollars, and then I'll say, "Hey, let's go," and then they'll almost get, well, they almost got offended, I think, because they wanted to keep playing, and I regurgitated their intention of coming, but they just continued to play and they lost the money, and then we left, and they left so unhappy. I'm curious to know, like, how much was your biggest win and your biggest loss financially?
I think my biggest single win on a game was just under $30,000. Actually, I bet $30,000, and I think I won. May have got 25,000 plus my original bet back. So I probably won about 25,000. My biggest loss was 32,000, I think. On a single game. You know, but that's interesting what you just described there, because I had a moment. I was in Las Vegas one time with a friend of mine, and we were actually in a casino playing blackjack. And I wasn't a big casino gambler. I was sports and sports book and that sort of thing. But we happened to be in a casino playing blackjack, and I may have started with a few $100, and all of a sudden, before I knew it, I was up over $15,000. And you think, I remember my friend telling me, "Hey, maybe we shut her down now." Maybe it's time to call her good. You started with a few $100 and you're up to 15,000. It might be a good time to go shut her down. And I couldn't. And so what I didn't know, though, at the time, because I was in such a fog, and I was so excited, and in the rush, what I didn't realize was my friend was slowly pulling chips from my pile. And so he pulled probably $4,000 or $5,000 out and stuck it in his pocket, and I didn't even know about it. As I rattled through all of my winnings, which I did, and I lost everything, and I thought, wow. And I woke up the next morning thinking, I was up 15 grand and I'm down to nothing. And then he came to me and he said, "Well, I was able to save you some. Here you go." And he handed me I think it was like $4,500 or something.
Wow.
And so, because he could see what my mentality, like, I didn't have there are people that can gamble responsibly. I get that. Like, I could not stop doing it. My brain was so screwed up that I just could not stop.
Yeah, for those of us who have never been in a situation of being, like, of owing so much money that you don't even have or you can't even provide, what's that experience like? Like, what's life like in general, just having that massive burden over your shoulder? Were you
It's
fearful?
it's it's indescribable, but I'll do my best to try and bring you inside my world there for a little bit. It was from about 2012 to 2015. I was living in a constant state of paranoia. I was working for myself. I worked for myself as a contractor, right? And so I was doing landscape and home improvement projects for customers. And so, obviously what happens is you gain their trust, and then they would write me these big checks, 20, 30, $40,000 deposit checks for projects. And what was happening is, I mean, somebody hands a gambling addict $30,000, that's a problem. you know, and I
Yeah.
my intentions were never ever to take people's money and just hit the road. My intentions were, okay, well, I've got 30 grand that this guy just gave me. I'm going to take $20,000 of that. I'm going to bet it on a couple games over here. I'll take the other 10 and I'll actually start the project. So it'll make it look like I'm actually doing it. But in my mind, I'm telling me, okay, that 10 grand will last for about a week. And then I'm going to need to get recoup this other money that I just gambled with so that I can finish this project. Well, more often than not, I would lose that 20 grand. And so now you can see, I mean, that was a process that went on for 2 to 3 years. So come by about 2014, 2015, I was over $1 million in debt. I had people chasing me. I had a client tell me one time he was going to take, this is a client of mine who actually had spent time in federal prison for doing bad things. He said, "Look, I do know some people and I'm going to take you out. I've had enough of your nonsense." And he did one night send 3 guys over to my house, and that was a scary moment. But it was things like that were starting to happen. People were chasing me down. I was getting calls from detectives, law enforcement, and so it was a constant state of paranoia. And all the while, the other side of this is I was keeping this hidden from my wife. She had no idea this was going on. And so I would spend all day dodging all of these bullets and distracting and deflecting and lying to customers and law enforcement. And then I would go home and try and put on this happy face to my wife as if everything's okay today. And so it's indescribable. I mean, the constant paranoia, the pain, the living a lie was really difficult.
Yeah, you just briefly touched on keeping it a secret from probably everyone. How did you go about keeping it a secret? Like, were you hiding your bank statements? Did you have like other accounts that you had financial assets in? Or did you put things away? Did you hide things? What did you do exactly?
So it started out with, first of all, the one thing I'll say about gambling addiction is, and this is my story of being able to hide this, is it's almost universal with gambling addicts, because it's not, you don't see the physical effects on us that you would with a drug addict or an alcoholic. And so people don't recognize it. And so, yeah, but with the financials and that sort of thing, there were always stories, right? I mean, I had, to my wife, I would come up with a story about this or a lie about that. And banks we would all of a sudden, my wife would get a call from the bank that they had frozen her account because I had access to it. And I had written a bunch of checks off of her account and deposited them into my account. And so you could see what's going on. But then my wife would call me in a panic and ask me what's going on. And she trusted me at the time to handle our finances. And so I would just tell her, hey, look, let me go to the bank. I'll take care of it. And I would go talk to the bank. And in the meantime, I'm trying to hustle more money on the side to get it into the bank to make it look like things are okay. And so it's this constant balancing act, right? Of lies, deception, hustling, all while trying to gamble at the same time. And yeah, right. And it's,
Wow.
Jake, what happens is
Wow.
we spin people in a circle to the point where they're almost confused, like, what is going on here? Like, what do I believe? Right. And that's how my wife was. She was just towards the end, like, not sure what to believe, but she still trusted me. She still wanted to believe in me. So usually I would tell her something, and the tendency is for the spouse to always believe their partner, right? Because they're so close to them, where they don't want to believe the worst. Whereas on the outside, like some of our friends and some of our family members would notice things and to talk to my wife and say, hey, look, something's going on here. You need to get to the bottom of this. And so, it becomes a state of mass confusion for everybody, just not only the gambler, but the family and the wives and the spouses, because it's a constant state of lies and deception,
Right. How did she eventually find out? And how was the trust regained?
So we had come back from, this would have been February 2nd, 2015. We had just come back from a trip to Arizona. We went down for the Super Bowl, and then had just come back. And before we went down there, I had sent an email to a family member. Basically, I think it was a cry for help is what it was. I had never had the courage to come out and just put all the cards on the table, so to speak, and just tell my wife what was going on. But I did send a kind of a weird cryptic email to a family member saying, hey, I need a bunch of money. I've got some gambling problems. I'm in big trouble here. I didn't get any money, but when I came back, that family member had turned that email over to my father-in-law, my wife's father. So we came back from Arizona, and it was the very next day. My father-in-law called my wife and told her, hey, to come over to our house. We need to sit down and talk. And so that's how she found out after so many years. And then quickly, within 24 to 36 hours, they had put an intervention together where my wife's family and a couple of my family members got together and me, and as a group presented me with basically an ultimatum, said, here, you have an opportunity to go off to treatment if you want to accept this. You're a mess. You need help, right? And so, but my wife at the time was in she she had no idea the level of carnage that I had left behind. That would take months and really a couple of years to kind of sort through all of the stuff, you know.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing actually that they got together and responded in that way. It seemed like a loving, compassionate, and empathetic way to go about things instead of being judgmental and critical. Um, so yeah, more power to them. And they sound like incredible people. And did you So you decided to go then and there?
I did. So let me just backtrack just a little bit. So you mentioned it, yeah, very empathetic. Like they put their, but make no mistake, they were angry. Like every single one of
Yeah,
them. They were. I
yeah,
mean, I had.
yeah.
This wasn't just a thing where I had betrayed my wife. I had betrayed them as well. Given them my word, and as it turned out, my word wasn't worth anything because I was a full blown gambling addict, and so. Um, there was a lot of anger there, and it didn't go away right away. And the trust, you mentioned the trust a few minutes ago, that was completely broken. Okay, and so that isn't something, once that's broken, that bond of trust is broken. That's really difficult to get that back. But when that was presented to me, treatment, I was all over it. I was, to me, it was either that or I was at the point of trying to figure out ways where I could kill myself. I was suicidal at that point. And so once it was presented to me, I took that as a lifeline, and yeah, I didn't fight it for a second. I was on board with it and wanted to go get better. I had no idea what getting better meant or what that looked like, but I knew that I was at the end of the road.
Mm. And yeah, man, much love to you. A beautiful thing you've been able to do. So courageous and willing to want to be better, and I think seek help and just to improve your circumstances for you and your wife and your family. So that's something I would like to just congratulate you on.
I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
How did you respond mentally, like going through? Is it what would you call it? Is it addiction recovery? And did you ever relapse?
Yeah, I mean it's addiction recovery. Basically, the way I look at it is I've been clean, much like a drug addict. I've been clean now for 7.5 years. I did not relapse. No, there were some times early on though where I fought those thoughts. I remember going to my first football game after I got. Well, let me just rewind a little bit here. After treatment, I came home, and three weeks after I got home from treatment, I had to stand before a judge and accept the consequences of my choices during my addiction because I was charged with 2 counts of first-degree theft. And so I had a sentencing date set for when I got back from treatment. So then I went to jail. So I went to treatment, I was home for 3 weeks, and then I was sent off to jail. And so during that period of time while I'm sitting in jail, that gave me the time to kind of process. It was a terrible, awful place, but at the same time, it gave me time to process what I had done and how I was going to live my life going forward, and the tools I had learned in treatment. And so that was helpful. But yeah, I haven't relapsed, but I remember going to a football game a few months after I got out of jail with my son, sitting there looking around at all the people in the stands. There are 70,000 people in there. I'm thinking, my God, do people actually come to these games and not bet on them? Like, is that actually a thing?
Yeah.
And I'm sitting, like, people actually come just for the sport of it. Because in my brain, in my mind, for so many years, I couldn't fathom watching a football game or a sporting event without having action on it, without having money on it. And so that was a big time adjustment that really took a couple years for me to get to a point where I can actually just watch a game with my kids for the love of the game, right? And not have to have the mortgage payment on it or anything else. And so it took a while to kind of get through that. But I'm at a point now where I don't really have those thoughts anymore. And if I do, those gambling thoughts, I have tools, mental tools to kind of get through that.
It almost seems like they've made and they continue to make gambling easier to access. Like, and here in New Zealand, they've got the gambling machines, but I guess overseas as well, they also have they have phone apps. They have websites that you can go on to. Like, you don't actually physically need to leave your home now. What are your thoughts on like the online gambling scene? Do you think and obviously it's it's on the individual themselves. It's not the gambling per se, but do you think it makes people more susceptible to become gambling addicts?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's what I do now is as I try and get out there and share my struggle, but also raise awareness and make people aware, predominantly the younger people, high school kids, college kids, because yes, over here, everybody's gambling from their phone. You don't, back in, 20 years ago, you had to physically go, like you said, you had to go to a casino or you had to go to a sports book in my case, and actually put money down. Now it's all done from your phone here. Everybody has an app, everybody has these apps, and these college kids now, there was a study that came out recently where 8% of college kids in the US already have gambling addictions. And it's because of the apps on their phone and everything else. And there's very little over here. There's just very little education and awareness about what the dangers are. People just, these kids, they have all these credit cards now, and before you know it, some of them are maxed. They've maxed out all their credit cards, and it's there's no education and awareness, and so that's what I try and do now is make people aware of what's going on. But yeah, I mean it's so accessible, and there just aren't many checks and balances. You know what I mean? So it's becoming a problem. And over in the UK, it's even worse. The UK, they've been betting on sports over there for longer than we have over here, and they're starting to see the ramifications over there that we're going to see here in another 10 to 15 years.
Do you recall taking your last bet, and did you know it would be your last bet? And I think when I when I asked that, I think about the inmates on death row when they can decide to have their final meal. Was it something like that?
You know what? That's funny. No, it wasn't at all. I don't even. Because I tell you, because at the very end, it wasn't even. I'm gambling or betting like the last month really wasn't even on my radar, because I was completely out of money, and I had no more resources, and I had stolen some heavy equipment. Like I stole a bulldozer. I'm not making this up. Like I rented a bulldozer, a big old heavy equipment from a guy I knew, and sold it for yeah, right, yeah. And that money.
Oh, well.
Yeah, I mean, we could chuckle about it now, but I mean, back, and so my mentality was so cloudy, and that money I got from that, I don't even know where it went. I probably had to pay off some guy who was threatening to kill me, and so that's probably why I did that, So to be honest with you, I don't even remember my last bet. It was, probably right around that time, December 2014 or January, around the Super Bowl, somewhere in there. But it was my mentality and my life was such, it was so foggy and convoluted, and I was so scared and paranoid that it's hard to really remember.
Right. And to all the people that are experiencing a gambling addiction, what advice do you typically give them?
Well, the first piece of advice I give anybody that's struggling with gambling addiction is if you think you have a problem, you do. Okay, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. If you're starting to think, hey, I might be gambling too much, or I'm doing things that are out of character, that's another thing. If you start doing things that are out of character and out of bounds and making bad choices to feed your gambling problem, then you need to say something to somebody. And for me, I didn't have the courage to do that. There were many junctures along the way for me where I could have come out and minimized the damage, and it wouldn't have gotten to the point where it did. with me if I would have just said something early on. So what I always tell them is it may seem bad now, but it's going to be a hell of a lot worse if you don't say something to somebody. And if you don't want to say something to somebody close to you, there are numbers to call. There is a Gamblers Anonymous phone number you can call, and it may be a stranger on the other line, but it's somebody that will talk to you, and you can tell them what's going on, and they may guide you a little bit and give you some resources or directions you can go with it. Because what happens is, if it gets to the point where it got with me, it's there aren't many. There are only a few outcomes. One is it's and we say this in the gambling community. It's the gambling recovery community. It's prison, insanity, and death. Right? Those are the three outcomes. So if you think it's a problem, it is. Say something, and that will help to minimize the damage and get you on the right path.
Yeah, beautifully said. Thank you so much for sharing that. And before, you were speaking about how if the thoughts, if you begin ruminating about wanting to gamble, you have certain techniques or tools. I'm just curious to know whether or not you could just share one or two things that you do, that you implement and practice in your life to help you break free from that.
You mean like to keep me in where I'm at now?
Yes.
Clean. Yes. Well, so I have a couple things that I can draw from, and fortunately and unfortunately, I have these experiences to draw from. I go back, if I'm ever struggling or having thoughts of gambling or whatever, I go back to the time I spent in jail. And those were lonely days. Not knowing if I was going to have a marriage or a family to go back to because of my gambling addiction. And so I go back to that. But again, a lot of people don't have that. They don't get to that point. And so what I would say is, there are certain tools that, again, I learned in treatment, that help me, simple things too, like meditation. And I think that's good for a lot of people, and just to help relieve your stress and everything else. Meditation, things like that, and therapy too. Like, I'm a big proponent of counseling and therapy for whatever is bothering you. I don't think there used to be a stigma around it. Maybe there still is with certain people, but I think it's healthy. I think talking to professionals about what you're going through, because we all mentally go through stuff. For me, it was gambling addiction, and then on top of that, I had to rebuild a marriage. But if you feel like you need help, just go talk to a professional and try and talk through your issues, and then get some professional advice, basically. And that's one thing I continue to do, and I always will do. I'll never get to the point in life, I don't think, where I don't feel like I need to go talk to people or talk to a professional or my therapist.
Could you just take me back to the addiction recovery? Where was this place, and what did a typical day look like for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So again, I live in Washington State. We're northwestern corner of the country. I went back to a treatment facility called Project Turnabout, and it's in Minnesota. So right in the middle of the country here, and it was, the good thing about it is that I was in a program that was gambling specific. Okay. So I wasn't commingling with drug addicts and alcoholics. I was in with a group of people that had gambling addictions, and that was it. Some had cross addictions, but the treatment each day was, it was intense. We'd get up at 6 o'clock, and you're in intense therapy and group sessions and individual sessions for basically 8 to 9 hours a day, with little breaks in between. But you're removed. I was completely removed from society and my wife and everything else. And so you also have this thing going on. It's like, for me, I was thinking constantly about what my wife is uncovering and discovering today that she had no idea about. So I'm trying to balance that with also trying to listen to the professionals tell me what I need to do to get healthy. But it was a 30-day process, a 30-day program. And what a lot of people don't, on the outside looking at a gambling addict, a lot of people don't understand gambling addiction. They just think it's a choice, and why don't you just stop doing it? They don't they don't throw it in there with drug addiction and alcoholism, when the fact of the matter is the brain chemistry and what's going on inside the brain is almost identical to that. So it is a full-blown addiction, which I didn't even know at the time, and it's a progressive disease. And so I left there after 30 days, knowing, after learning what I learned there, knowing that I had to have a plan in place going forward, outpatient therapy, structure, things like that, to continue, because it wasn't like just going to treatment for 30 days was going to fix me. I have had all of these behaviors built up over the course of so many years of gambling and lying. Those just don't go away in 30 days. And so I learned that in treatment. They taught me that. And then from that point forward, it's just been a constant process of trying to stay mentally focused on what I need to do, my recovery. And with that, slowly but surely, all these other things like the old behaviors and choices and things I used to make have kind of gone away.
And when you left this addiction recovery retreat or center, how did that change your perspective on life, and like how did that change you as an individual, having gone in there and then going through that 30-day process? When you left, did you want to do something like different with your life, or did you have a different goal or some type of attitude that you wanted to express and like uncover and discover?
Yeah, so it's a real process. I went through the 30-day treatment stage, and with any addict, in my case, I had been an addict for many, many years and done a lot of terrible things to feed that addiction. So I went through the shame and guilt phases, and that went on for a while. It wasn't like I just came home after 30 days and those went away either. Like, the shame and the guilt stayed with me for a while, probably a couple of years, where I was afraid at times to even go to the grocery store for fear of running into somebody that I knew, because everybody knew my story. I was on the news and all over the place. So I was afraid, like, to go anywhere for a while because of all the shame. And so getting, but then what happened after a couple of years, yeah, I was able to make a difference in other people's lives because I shared my story and they found hope in my story. And so they had maybe a drug addiction or whatever else. And through talking with me, they were able to get help. And so what happened to me was, I'm like, whoa, I spent all these years taking from people, emotionally, financially, spiritually, taking from people to feed my addiction. Now I actually have the ability to make a difference in other people's lives. And for somebody like me, who did so many things bad, who did so many bad things, made so many bad choices, to be able to do good, that's a huge motivator. And so from that point forward, that's kind of what I do. And that's what I focus on. I try and get in front of groups and speak, not necessarily with the intent of reaching everybody, but knowing that one person or two people in that audience may need to hear my story and may get something from it. And that's what drives me, just the ability to educate and make a difference, and hopefully steer somebody in a better direction.
Yeah. What are your biggest takeaways, like having gone through the experiences in your life that you have?
Well, the biggest one is that your word is everything. That's one thing that I've learned through this. Like we talked about it earlier, the sacred bond of trust is a fragile thing. And so once that's broken, I'm fortunate because my wife, she gave me the opportunity to rebuild that and rebuild our marriage. Many people don't get that. Many people like me don't even get that chance. They're done, right? You did wrong, you're done. So one of my biggest takeaways is that it's the sacred bond of trust. You tell somebody something, you do it. Okay. And if you're doing wrong, if you've got an addiction and you're making bad choices, we go back to what we said a few minutes ago, seek help, before it gets too bad, because we all fall down at times. All right. We all struggle. Nobody goes through this life with just scot-free and living in, fairy tales and unicorns, right? I mean, we all have problems. We all have issues. And so if you're ever struggling with anything, seek help, talk to a friend, talk to a family member, talk to a stranger, call somebody if it's drug addiction, alcoholism, gambling, just mental health in general. We need to talk about it. We need to be open about it, because if we keep it in, the more we keep it in and internalize, the harder it is to get better and get healthy and stay healthy.
Absolutely. I want to ask you, what are your thoughts on gambling now? You said you had kids. I'm not sure if they're old enough to gamble, but what if they started gambling, or your wife started gambling, or a good friend of yours began gambling? How would you respond, or how do you respond to those moments?
Yeah, that's a good question. I try. So one thing about me is I don't like to preach to people, right? I fell off the rails. I went completely off the rails. But I recognize that many people can gamble responsibly, drink responsibly. And so I have never always tried to stay away from preaching. But what I will tell people is, especially my kids, my oldest son is 13 now. And so we just recently sat him down. We wanted to wait until he was old enough to kind of process some of this stuff. So we just recently, in the last year, sat down with him and explained what happened to me 7 years ago. How I ended up in jail, and those were consequences of my gambling addiction, and this is what can happen. And if addiction runs in your family, if you're predisposed to it, your risk factor goes way up. Okay, even if you have an alcoholic or a drug addict in your family, you may, if you start gambling, you could fall into gambling addiction. And so it's things to look out for, right? And that's what I try and impress. And my youngest, we have another son too. He's too young yet to understand any of this, but when he's old enough, we'll educate him too. But I just want to, if my son ever decided to gamble, I'm not going to be the parent that says you can't live your life. Okay. But what I am going to do is I'm going to give him the tools, educate him. My wife and I both will give him the tools and educate him through our experience and what we know, so that when he comes across those situations in his, when he's in high school and college or whatever, he's prepared for it. And that's all we can do as parents. I mean, we can't, I'm never going to be that parent that says you can't ever have a drink of alcohol, or you can't ever go play cards or this, but here's what can happen if you're not careful, because you are predisposed to addiction.
I love that. And I love it because it's to me, it comes off as grounded, as centered, as open, like willing to respect that their life is their life. And, although we are parents to these children, it's still their life. And I think, like, for myself and here in New Zealand, I think like the culture itself is we're missing true parenting, like parenting like that. Parents who can articulate and understand and be compassionate and empathetic and loving and open. So the fact that you exuberate that, and I think just normalizing this whole entire conversation and like the topics we've spoken about, like that is incredible. I have never been to jail personally, so I'm just curious. Like, I'm just briefly curious to know what it was like for you going to jail for the first time. Like, how did it feel? Like, because for me personally, I see all I hear about jail is, negative things, bad things, a lot of fights, a lot of felons, a lot of, nasty things going on inside of there. Like, to me, that's what the perception of jail is. How did you feel going into it, and what was it really like being there?
Yeah. And so that's, I'm glad you brought that up. It's because I had never been there. And yeah, we all have this idea, this perception of what jail is. And you touched on it. It's actually not that far off from the way you just described it. I mean, there's fights going on all the time,
Yeah.
constantly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Oh
it's
man.
for somebody like me, you're in there with people that are almost resigned to their fate in life, if you know what I mean. They've been in and out of jail so often, it's just become part of their existence. And whether they had parents that were in and out of jail and they just kind of followed in that vein, or what. But I was determined not to be one of them. I did not want, this was not me, you know. And I would talk to fellow inmates in there, and they'd be like, "What are you doing here?" You know, and I would tell them, "Well, this is what happened to me," you know, and they're like, "Man, you don't fit here." So, um, but but having said that, you know, I would, it's sad too, because I would talk to these inmates, and man, you just see just the glazed over look in their eyes, because they've been in and out so many times. They can't find a way out, whether they grew up in a tough neighborhood and that's all they knew. So it's a sad place. It's a lonely place. It's a scary place. For me, I kind of just kept to myself as much as I could, and just tried to process, like I said earlier, tried to process what I learned in treatment, so that when I did get out of there, I had a plan in place. But I got to tell you, it's scary and it's lonely, and it's no place I ever want to go again.
Oh, wow. Um, where do you hope, well, not hope, where do you want to take this? Because like you've been through this life journey, and you know, obviously immense suffering has been involved, but through suffering comes insight, wisdom, you know, knowledge, lived experience. Where do you want to take all of this now? Like, you're absolutely passionate about speaking about all of this stuff and normalizing it. Where do you want to take it, and where will you take all of this?
So yeah, thanks for asking that question. I just finished writing a book recently. That'll be out later this year. It's about my struggle and kind of what I went through and what I learned about that. But I'm at a point now where I have some opportunities to get in front of again, college students and the younger crowd. That's the demographic I'm trying to get to. And again, just talk to them and let them know what can happen. That's my goal now, is just to raise awareness and educate. Okay. And I'll be giving a TED talk here coming up in October, where I'll have the opportunity to get my story out there a little bit more, you know, and so people can kind of see what's actually happening. Because again, in our country, nobody's talking about this. Okay. We all know about alcoholism and drug addiction. And our parents teach us about that as kids, like, but they don't teach us about gambling addiction. And it's not thought of as an addiction in this country. It just isn't. You know, it's thought of as fun and harmless. Well, it's destroying lives. And so I'm trying to get people to understand that, you know, and so that's what I'm focused on now. You know, my wife is involved with some of the things I do, and she's very passionate about this as well, you know, and the more we're able to get in front of groups and educate and talk with local government officials and trying to get some of these things, these measures in place, education and that sort of thing. Um, you know, that's my focus right now.
Beautiful. And where could people find the book when it is released?
Yeah, they'll be able to find it on Amazon, and I'll put that. It should be out sometime this fall or early winter, and I'll put that out on probably my Twitter or some of my social media sites, and they would be able to find the link there.
Cool. That'd be great. So I like to ask these two final questions, and it's just to normalize celebrating oneself and celebrating each other, and to allow like me and the listeners to celebrate with you. So what are you most proud of doing in this life?
Right now, I think I'm most proud at this point of the father that I've become through this process. I wouldn't be in a sick and twisted sort of way. I'm happy I'm glad I went through this experience because of where it's brought me today. I wouldn't wish it upon anybody, but fortunately, my oldest son was young enough during that period of time to where he doesn't remember a lot of that. And I'm a father now to my two boys that I don't know that I would have been. Going back to the beginning of our conversation, I had a lot of my father's little tendencies built into me. And then I went through a life-changing experience, and I've come out the other side, and I'm a much better father. And I'm also a much better husband, you know? And so those are the two things that I'm most proud of today. And I continue to work on those, you know, and I never, ever take that for granted, because I know if for some reason, if I ever fell back and fell off the wagon and started gambling again, it would all be gone in a second, and so I don't take any of it for granted.
Do the like things that the same things that you've done in the past, do they come up in like amongst your family collective, your you and your wife, or you and your extended family? Do any of these issues ever arise, or do they arise in a positive nature?
Yeah, that's great that you just threw that in there at the end, because that's how it is with my family and the friends that I have now. Is I'm very open about this. A lot of gambling addicts, and I'll say this too. You can do, and people do recovery however they want to do it. That's awesome. Whether they want to do it in silence or be like me and be open about it. And so I've made the decision to be open about it. And so any conversations I have with friends or family, and we may talk about this stuff, and we do a lot, it's all positive. It's all about, okay, well, we're not dwelling on the past. We know what you did. We know the choices you made, and now we know why you made those choices. And it's all positive. But having said that, there were a lot of people in my life prior to my recovery, during my addiction years, that are gone forever. Like they cut me off and they're gone forever. And that's another part of this where, and that's fine. I don't, that's just part of the deal. But I don't associate, I'm not around people like that are going to talk about that stuff negatively, right? Because of where I am today, this is what we can do with this. We can turn this into a positive, and that's kind of how we do it.
Yeah, precisely. Even like, yeah, your friend, your friend groups, people you spend your time with. Like, it's so important that we become conscious of the spaces that we hold, and the spaces that we allow others to hold for us, because I think we definitely are a product of our environment, and if we're not consciously taking stock of who we're hanging out with and spending our time with, and what they are about at their essence, then it's not going to positively impact your life. So, um, what is your hope for the world and for future generations?
Wow, that's a tough one. I like that question.
Yeah.
My hope for the world. Wow, I don't know, but I just, again, just kind of going back to what we talked about earlier. I believe in talking about our struggles. Okay, mental health is a huge thing with me, like you. I mean, it's we all have struggles. Okay, and we need to talk about it and be open about it, and not keep that in and internalize it, like I said earlier. So the more we talk about our problems, the more we meet with professionals if we need to, the better off we're going to be, and the better parents to our children we're going to be down the road. Okay, the more we can educate our kids, the better off they're going to be. And that's for me, that's my purpose now in life. My main purpose is to send my kids on a good path as they get older, right? And be a good husband and a good mentor and a good teacher. And so that's it, man. I mean, it's just being open about your struggles, and not being afraid to talk about it, and getting away from what I said earlier, that old school approach of this stigma around mental health and addiction. It's okay to admit you got a problem. Okay, so it's okay to admit that you're struggling. It's how do we deal with it? How do we talk about it and be open about it? And so that's it. It really, it's just openness and a willingness to try and get better each day.
Yeah, beautifully articulated. I often think about that, right? Like just how it just seems like being human, like society will tell you that being human is this fixed, like as a fixed position, like as a fixed identity. And it boggles my mind now, like having gone through the experiences I've gone through, and to be who I am today, to like just to contemplate and like comprehend what like the essence of that view itself. Like it totally it doesn't make sense at all to be fixed, or to or to just be this one thing. So I appreciate you like acknowledging that, and just normalizing and bringing forth to the table, like to conversate about mental health, seeking help, and just being open with yourself, being vulnerable, not taking that old school approach. And, here in New Zealand, it's, she'll be right, mate. Like it's all good, but really it isn't. So we should absolutely seek help. We should endeavor to be better people, better, better friends, better family members, better husbands, better parents. So, yeah. Um, Thank you for your time, Patrick. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your story, and to be open and to be willing to be courageous enough to speak about the experiences you've had, and we've touched on personal things in your life, and you've just been so open about that. And I hope that the people who listen to this, the listeners, can take something away from it, and they will, and this will empower us. And it just, I get really passionate about these things. So thank you so much, and thank you for your time, and many blessings, much love, and may your life continue to flourish.
Well, Jake, same to you, man. I really appreciate you having me on, and I know that you're doing great things too, and this podcast is one of them. And I just, again, I appreciate you having me on, and hopefully we can stay in touch down the road.
Yeah, much love. I'll definitely keep tabs on the progress you have in your journey. So thank you.
Thanks, Jake. Appreciate it.